Hi, good morning. Welcome on behalf of the participants of reclaiming the United Nations as a peace organization. Could all the participants stand up? Put on those big smiles we had, do you remember? On the first morning? They were ridiculously big, right? Let's see them. Look at your neighbor. Bring that smile. Thank you. You can sit. So on behalf of that group and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF, I am Maria Butler. I work for WILPF, and we are very happy to be here to bring our analysis and our perspectives to the United Nations and to our colleagues in member states hosted by the City of Geneva. We have with us the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination of the United Nations. Fabrizio, can you put on one of those big smiles we just had? Thank you. He has spent the last 3 days with the heads of the UN agencies. He is here to listen to us. Thank you. We have Lopa, who's been with us for the last 2 days, the chief of the civil society section of UN Women. Lopa, can you bring that smile back? We've said a lot about UN Women. We've said a lot about UN Women, and today we're talking about the how we can move forward. So without further ado, I would like to invite our host, Steve Bernard. He is the head of the Office of External Affairs for the City of Geneva, and he is here to welcome us on behalf of the city. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maria. Members of the International Board of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Madam Secretary General of the WILPF, heads and representatives of intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, so many of which I have to apologize to for not being able to mention them all today. Partners, sections, and staffers from the WILPF, ladies and some gentlemen, dear friends. On behalf of the Executive Council of the City of Geneva, whom I have the honor to represent this morning, as they are out of the city today, let me warmly welcome you to the closing ceremony of your convening here in the Palais Hénard, seat of the Executive Council. As you certainly know, Geneva is a small Swiss city with a rich history of openness to persecuted people, newcomers, and new ideas. When the Red Cross movement was launched by Geneva citizens, a city which nowadays is the most diplomatic center worldwide, hosting a major United Nations office, as you have noticed in the past days, 34 intergovernmental organizations, 250 diplomatic representations, and some 350 international NGOs. Geneva is a city that cares, a city of peace and dialogue where solutions are negotiated and brought to the benefit of the world population. Geneva is indeed honored to have welcomed your convening to give voice to activist women representing the numerous facets of the civil society coming from many countries and organizations. The authorities of the City of Geneva regret that nowadays, women's participation, let me start over because the sentence is important. The authorities of the City of Geneva regret that nowadays women's participation in some intergovernmental fora may be hampered or made impossible by political or discriminatory practices. Be assured, ladies and gentlemen, that the City of Geneva will always do its best to welcome and assist organizations like yours that contribute to a better world. Since 1915, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has brought together women from all around the world, united in working for peace by non-violent means and promoting political, economic, and social justice for all. A century later, it is still an ongoing struggle to ensure that the status and condition of women be improved worldwide. For many years now, the City of Geneva has been firmly engaged and committed along this objective, and it will continue to play an active role in this effort. In the framework of its sustainable development policy, Geneva defends and promotes the values of equality and diversity, essential preconditions to the development of a dynamic and creative society to ensure the self-fulfillment for each of us. The action of the City of Geneva in this matter is developed in three different but closely connected axes: cultural diversity, equality between men and women, non-discrimination based on gender or sexual orientation. In order to raise the awareness of the Geneva public on those issues, the city organizes in March of each year a so-called Equality Week that places equality and gender matters at the center of our discussion. In the same spirit, in May of each year, the City of Geneva, together with civil society organizations, sets up public poster campaigns aimed at increasing the population's awareness to counter, again, sexual or gender-based discrimination. These are, ladies and gentlemen, some of the very few specific activities carried out by the City of Geneva to improve the society where we live. We are talking here about major challenges. And even if the times we live in are certainly in many ways transitional, some of the constraints we face begin to dwindle, and some of our hard-fought freedoms are progressively sinking in as intangible. Hence, we should all mobilize to continue our efforts. Nobody can remain indifferent to the universal struggle for peace and freedom. It is thanks to the tireless engagement, including from persons, associations, and organizations such as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, committed to contribute actively to this cause, that one day the world will be fairer and more equitable. The life we want for the present and future generations, a world where women will be given the right place they deserve. I thank you for your attention.
We've talked a lot about the feminist movement, right? Our collective power, and recognizing and respecting each other's roles in the feminist movement. I have the privilege to acknowledge and also introduce a leader in that movement. I was reading a quote about Jane Addams, and when you were talking about 1915, does everybody know Jane Addams? She was one of the founders of WILPF, the first woman, US woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And there was a quote about her this week that said, she had an amazing capacity to work, and really work, it says work, from the specific case to general philosophy, and had the ability to apply an overall strategy to a particular instant. That was Jane Addams, and it is Madeleine Rees. First, let's thank Madeleine because she is to be acknowledged for her vision to bring WILPF forward right now in this time of shrinking space and militarization, but also for bringing us here to Geneva. We can thank you for doing that, Madeleine. So let's just collectively acknowledge that she is a rebel, she is an activist, and she is a true truth maker. She will be summarizing right now, or attempting to summarize some of what we have discussed in the United Nations about reclaiming the Institute for us. Madeleine.
Thank you, Maria. That's really sweet. I'm just going to say that, I'm what she said about me making this happen. I just have that luxury of women of a certain age who just make decisions, and then I have these fantastic people who make it happen. So basically, without WILPF, without the WILPF staffers, without all of you showing the same commitment, without the amazing women from Oak who really pushed for this, we wouldn't be here. So it's really a team effort. So, I'm going to try and summarize, but it's going to take like 2 minutes because it will take 4 days to summarize what we've said in 2 days, and we haven't anywhere near finished yet, team. So we've got a lot of work to do today because there's some pending conflicts about to start that we've got to stop. I want to talk a little bit about what we've identified. The biggest thing I think that we've all come up with is that there's a huge disconnect between what's really happening in country and what the responses of the international community are, in the responses of the United Nations, and in how that is distorting the realities. Basically, the international community is not listening, and it's not listening especially to women. As a result of that, there's been a failure to prevent conflict, and we've seen that from the beginnings of possible potential conflicts, from reversals of conflicts we thought were solved, falling back into conflict. We've not done prevention. So that failure to prevent leads to this escalation, and the responses in that escalation are traditional, formulaic, and based on a narrative which is coming top down, not from what people are saying. There is always a different narrative, and it's a narrative that really wants to embrace peace and avoid war, but we don't act quickly enough to encapsulate, to move on those voices and to change that traditional narrative so that we can avoid conflict in the first place. If we looked at root causes, if from the beginning, non-conflict, conflict, right the way through transition and then transformative justice, if we did all of that from a political economy, looking at who has the power, what are the forces at work, how that impacts on gender and gender relations, how that means we protect human rights and realize the equalities that we're talking about, how that means that there be a realistic recognition of civil and political rights, but also, and very, very importantly, social, cultural, and economic rights as being something which is fundamental to people's enjoyment of their lives rather than their existence. And we've seen and we identified inequalities as being absolutely at the core of the enjoyment of rights, which is failing to bring peace. And then ironically, the big elephant in the room is always the one we don't mention, and that is the arms trade. We heard yesterday how ridiculous it is. You get some of the biggest countries in the world eulogizing themselves for having given so much in humanitarian aid to various countries, and then that budget that they're giving in aid is dwarfed by the amount of money they're making from arms sales, which is causing the humanitarian catastrophe in the first place. We're not joining the dots. We're not actually seeing the complete picture, and until we start making those connections, until the international community starts taking action in making those connections, we will not have peace. Yesterday we looked at some of the solutions. We saw how, and I think it was brilliantly done by the panel, how in the humanitarian space we have the opportunity of changing that discourse, to move away from always the narrative of women as victims, always always a narrative of women without agency, to change it so that women are recognized as being the main actors in that humanitarian space, and then have the ability to dictate how humanitarian aid must be given, but to move from that to having the agency, the recognition, to be part of the discussions, not just the discussions, but to drive forward the negotiations for peace, and then to drive forward what must happen when that peace has been agreed. We identified the elements of a sustainable peace, and we identified particularly the absence of discussions of economic ideological approaches which are done after conflict or made during the negotiations for the ending of conflict, but which women are never included in. So you end up with the Bosnian model. And one model fits all. It's the Ukrainian model. It's going to be the same thing in every post-conflict scenario. That we have to reverse because we say that is a driver of conflict. So that was a snapshot. I started to identify what we want the UN to do. We started to identify what we're going to do. Today we take that further. So what Rola challenged us to do, and I think absolutely rightly, we need to work with member states. How do we work with member states? Yeah. Oh, better?
Yeah.
Sorry. How do we work with member states? Because we heard from, I think it was very well articulated by the UN themselves, that we are member states. The United Nations is run by member states. We can't expect them to go off on a frolic of their own, much as might be helpful on occasion. They have to be accountable and answerable to the membership. So we have to work with member states. So we need to know, what do we need to do with our governments? What we need to do with our governments to put pressure on other governments? How do we want our governments to work within the multilateral system? What do we want them to be saying at the Human Rights Council, at the CSW, in the General Assembly and in the Security Council? How do we want them to behave? And we want them to behave in a way that we suggest would be appropriate. We then need to talk about the UN presence in country. We heard yesterday and the day before so much of this disjunct, DRC, a mandate from the Security Council which is not appropriate or effective for addressing the needs of the women on the ground. What if we flipped that? What if it was the consultation with the NGOs and the women on the ground which dictated what the Security Council mandate actually said? So it could be really effective. How do we make that happen? How do we make that work? What about the countries that are not in conflict but where there's a strong technical cooperation program from the UN? We identified yesterday, we don't want just a formulaic, let's do women's economic empowerment, let's do this. No, let us talk to the UN agencies so they actually recognize what people are wanting to have done, and then help in the design of programs properly funded, effectively monitored, to make sure that that works. And then we have to say what we're going to do, because it's not all up to them. We have undertaken yesterday to do certain activities, and we will develop and progress those further today. At the end, we will then have the three parts that make up the United Nations system: the people, the UN, the member states. And then Fabrizio and I'm going to dump it on UN Women to see how we can actively take this forward. But three parts together, it's deeds, not words. We've done a lot of the words, we're now going to do a lot of the deeds. So, now the floor is yours, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, who from yesterday, to actually take forward the conversation. Lisa, backed by popular acclaim, and Barbara, will have dual facilitation. And the first one we want to look at is what on earth are we going to do with our states so that they actually reflect what it is that we need to have said in breaking the traditional narrative, so that it's one that is reflective of what we say has to happen for an effective and sustainable peace. Lisa.
All right, well, we got our marching orders from Madeline. We've got 3 questions we need to answer. One is, what do we want to do in terms of putting pressure on states so that they put pressure on the UN and other states to uphold human rights and to increase our access to meaningful participation. Our second question is going to be, what are our demands for the UN working in country? And then our third question is, how are we going to work together to make this happen? So it's really building off of yesterday in terms of looking at our ideal UN and what components it would have. And today, we're going to get to that question of how. We're going to get to that specific concrete actions that we want to see a UN that is reclaimed by us. Sound good for a plan? Okay, so we only have about maybe 30 minutes per question, right?
Nella, are you timekeeping? You were designated last night? Yes. Timekeeper extraordinaire.
So Nella, you keep us on time and make sure that we stick to our 30 minutes per question so that we have time for each question.
Do we have an extra mic? Yes.
And so maybe we'll begin. And the question is, again, what are we going to do? What do we want to ask states to do to put pressure on the UN and other states to uphold our meaningful participation, to uphold our human rights, and to uphold the mandates of peace? I see our first hand.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Madeleine, for representing the outcome of our discussions in the last two days. Since I started participating in this conference, those words, "the time is now," keep coming back to me. And I really think the time is now. I don't want us to leave a legacy to our daughters and our granddaughters that we ourselves found in this world, where inequality continues to be the main cause of a lot of the conflicts that we experience in our countries around the world. So what are we going to do? One, I think we must, all of us, go back to our governments and insist on them that they change the composition of their delegations to the UN, and they can do this so that there is equal representation of men and women. We heard yesterday that the IPU has a particular condition for the participation of their members, and I don't see why our governments can't do the same. They have the power to do that. We, the people, can give them the power to do that, to make sure that the impact on the delegations that go to the UN. The second thing is, through UN Women, we really want the UN to hear our voices. We have said that many women from around the world are not able to participate meaningfully with the CSW taking place in New York. I would like to see that we actually put pressure on the UN to ensure that we have the next CSW not in New York, even if it's just the one that we're not going to have in New York, but we push on that campaign, that we actually use the weapon or the strategy, I want to use weapon, the strategy of boycott, to say we will boycott the CSW if it continues to happen in the US, where people are not allowed to go. I then also want us to undertake a project, and this is the last point I'm making. I want us to undertake a project where together, as this gathering, we take a case study. We look at Bosnia. We've heard so much about how everything went wrong in Bosnia. We take that case study and we use it to draw out the elements, the very things that you've just articulated, that we say are wrong in the way the UN process, the template is formulated. We want that to change. Of course, I have another project, but I would like somebody else to raise that point about the IFIs. Thank you so much. My name is Nozizwe Madlala Routledge from South Africa.
Okay, we have some hands up in the back. If you can just start by saying your name, that would be very helpful.
Thank you for giving me the word. My name is Annie Matundu. I'm from DRC. I'm the president of WILPF DRC. what we want to see UN doing in the context of DRC. We want women to stop, to tell the other states to stop selling arms in the country they are in the conflict. We want the peacekeeper who is in DRC to listen the local community, because it is them who knows the basic needs. And also to transform the information to the UN Chapter 7, who is saying we need to protect the population in the case of the conflict. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine Ronderos from WILPF, Colombia. We were discussing here with my colleague from Colombia as well about this very important question, because we feel sometimes that they pass the ball to each other like, oh, this is the responsibility of member states. Oh, this is the responsibility of the UN. And it's very difficult as a civil society to identify who is the main player and who do you ask or who do you request your petitions. So we have petitions for each. So for example, for the UN, in the case of Colombia, the UN has been a great ally for us and for the respect for human rights and for influencing women's voices and gender perspective into the final agreement between the government of Colombia and FARC. So for us, a petition is we need the UN to continue staying in Colombia, because in the international, as part of the international community concerns, because we sign an agreement, then we are entering a post-conflict scenario, and then we're done. And then you guys can sort it out your problems, and the UN is leaving. And for us, it's like, no, we need the support of the UN. It's been our ally throughout this time. Same with UN Women. And regarding member states and Colombia, I mean, we know that Colombia has the best legislation, has very good draft of policies, but in practice nothing happens. And this is something that we fear in the implementation phase of the peace agreement. That is a good agreement, it's not perfect, but in the implementation phase is when we will see if we are going to achieve peace or not. And then the government and the Cancilleria, which is the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the woman leading, which is great, there is a woman, but she's not into 1325. She doesn't believe in 1325. So this is very critical for us, because it's the instrument that it has helped us to push forward the inclusion of women's voices during the peace negotiation and now the peace implementation. And government hasn't provided enough funding for the women's institutions at the national level, and not even think about the local level and regional level. And this is very critical for us to continue pushing our agenda and all the critical points that are in place for the implementation. That's why for us it's very important to address that we are not in a post-conflict scenario, we're in a post-agreement scenario. And we would like to invite Sweden, other member states to adopt Sweden's policy for the feminist international policy. Is that the right name? But you know what I'm talking about. I think it's setting an example, and it will be great if other member states understand and adopt what that really means, because it's not just ticking the box of women participating or women at the table. It's more than that. It's how you mainstream what feminist is throughout all the government and all policies and all the implementation. So it is a very complicated recommendation because in the same way, that's the same, we feel that we don't know whose responsibility and what, because every time we go to another, they say, no, it's the member states, no, it's the UN. So probably this is the good scenario to say, these are our concerns, and we need the UN and the UN women to have more resources and to stay in Colombia at least for another 10 years. And the second mandate of the UN political mission in Colombia that is now moving from the Security Council to the General Assembly, we need to make sure that the mandate doesn't overlap with the already work of monitoring human rights in the country, but also have a strong influence on disarmament and arms control after the DDR process, and obviously women's participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Noha Gosen from Lebanon. I want to start with a saying by Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States. He said, "We can't be both ways. We can't be the world's leading champions of peace and the world's leading suppliers of arms." So my recommendation is that the United Nations should pressure the arms producing and supplying nations, the big nations, to stop selling arms at least to parties. Sell arms to countries, but not to parties, to different groups. And at least this is the first step. And more steps should follow, but let's start with this step at least. Because if there are arms, there's conflict. No arms, no conflict. Thank you.
Ok. Moi, je vais parler en français. Vous allez traduire. Genève, c'est un pays francophone. Je voudrais...
I can
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to speak in French. Geneva is, after all, a francophone place.
Ok, merci. Je vais dire 3 recommandations.
I want to make 3 recommendations.
La première, c'est que la RDC a la plus grande mission des Nations Unies.
First, the DRC is the site of the largest UN peacekeeping operation.
20 000 hommes,
20,000 men.
20 ans de la durée des missions,
It's been there for 20 years.
3 500 000 dollars par an de budget.
C'est plus ou moins $1 billion par an, je crois. It's about $1 billion a year, so an overall cost of, for each year, over $1 billion.
Tout ça, c'est vos contribuables qui donnent, les pays contributeurs donnent l'argent pour cette mission.
Those are the contributing countries, the countries you come from, who pay for that.
20 ans sans résultat.
20 years without any results.
Disons résultat mitigé parce qu'on n'arrive pas à mettre fin à la guerre.
And I say that because it has not succeeded to put an end to the war.
Et tous les pays contributeurs se plaignent.
And all the contributing countries complain.
Mais ne prennent pas le courage de dire évaluons et prenez une autre action.
But they don't have the courage to say, let's evaluate and do something differently.
Il est temps maintenant que les pays contributeurs évaluent et changent l'approche.
It's time now for the contributing countries to evaluate, to change their approach.
Il faut qu'on arrive à terminer la guerre à RDC.
We have to finish the war in DRC.
Et il y a des stratégies qui peuvent faire, on arrive à mettre fin.
And there are viable strategies that could reach
Je vais
that.
donner l'exemple à 2003.
I can give the example from 2003.
La France a envoyé à Bunia, toujours à RDC, 300 militaires
France sent to Bunia, which is in the DRC, 300 soldiers
Pour 3 mois,
for 3 months,
ils ont stabilisé la ville de Bunia.
and they managed to stabilize the situation in Bunia.
Pourquoi on ne peut pas apprendre de l'histoire et faire la même chose et terminer l'affaire?
Why can't we learn from that and do the same thing and finish the story?
Au lieu que vos populations continuent à envoyer de l'argent pour une mission qui ne termine pas.
But countries just keep on sending money for an endless mission.
Nous voulons une évaluation et une action directe pour qu'on termine la guerre à RDC.
We want an evaluation and concrete action to finally finish the war in DRC.
Deuxième chose,
Second point,
on nous invite dans le Conseil de sécurité.
that we don't have access to the Security Council.
J'ai déjà été là 3 fois
I was there 3 times
pour parler 3 minutes ou 5 minutes.
to speak just for 3 or 5 minutes.
Ça ne peut pas continuer comme ça.
It can't go on like that.
Nous, en tant que femmes, nous devons être partie prenante dans le Conseil de sécurité.
As women, we should have a full role in the Security Council. We
Nous
should
devons être considérés comme les citoyens de ce monde et participer correctement.
be considered as citizens of this world and participate appropriately.
Troisième chose,
Third point,
ONU Femmes,
man and woman,
Agence pour les femmes.
agency for women.
Nous voulons voir ONU Femmes plus vivantes,
We want to see UN women more lively,
une vraie agence de femmes.
a real agency for women.
Et je demande une évaluation
And I demand an evaluation
pour les actions de ONU Femmes dans les pays.
to see, to evaluate UN women's performance on the ground.
Quelle interaction ONU Femmes avec les femmes?
And it's how it interacts with women in the field.
Merci.
Thank you.
We just keep the mic coming forward, and then we can go back again, because we had some hands up here.
My name is Nariman Alfar from Palestine section. Actually, I would like to highlight the vision that we Palestinian people living under occupation, with the cooperation of the government in Palestine, we are trying to exert pressure on Israel for the continuous violation of human rights. But on the international arena, unfortunately, there's always continuous efforts to take all of these efforts aside. And we just recently remember the cause of Dr. Rima Khalaf when she said that Israel is a racist country, and she was resigning from her position because she was defending the Palestinian question and the question of the Palestinian people to live in freedom. What I want to highlight, how we can all together, as peace lovers, as NGOs and government efforts, can take all of this pressure exerted by Israel to encounter any effort on the international arena to put forward the Palestinian cause and to take a step forward to achieve a full statehood for the Palestinian people and their state in Palestine. Actually, we are really frustrated because one step is going on and another step is going back. That's why we feel sometimes dissatisfied with the UN agencies, and sometimes they say yes for the Palestinian question, and other time they are, of course, under threat and of the Israeli government efforts to say no for the Palestinian state, despite the fact that many NGOs all over the world supporting our effort to establish our statehood, and especially the women efforts. You know, we appreciate so much women efforts in all the organizations on a regional level, on the international level, as well all the channels in the Arab world and the international arena. What I'm really looking for, that we should bring together channels of cooperation from the NGOs, from the government, to exert pressure on the Israel for her continuous violations of the human rights in the Palestinian cities and countries. Thank you.
So we just have our 10-minute check. So we have 10 minutes. How many hands do we have up for this session? Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands, 10 minutes, 6 hands, which means if we can keep our comments to 2 minutes, that will give everyone a chance to participate in this session. Can we do that? Because we want to hear from everyone. Okay, Gorna.
Okay, Goran Mlinaric from Bosnia. I'm actually going to try quickly. First of all, we have to acknowledge the disbalance of power within the UN, and we are talking about different functional states. First of all, and this is the question regarding what we do towards the states. First of all, within the more powerful functional states, what we have to do is actually really push for the states to accept change in power disbalance and redistribution of power within the UN. So that's the first one with that respect. Within the non-functional state or states in conflict, it is different. First of all, again, bringing in the political economy. It's not really that the countries aren't contributing to UN, maybe they're not, but they are contributing by buying the guns, selling the natural resources. So it needs to be understood, yes, those countries are still participating, but in those states, we need to push for state creation in any way we can. How can we actually work together? And we need to work together. That's really bringing back solidarity. And in age of communication, we need to communicate more because we don't know what is needed in in different countries. So in the countries, functional countries, we need to know what is needed for the in non-functional countries to help them bring the issues up. So I try to speak to others.
My name is Khadija Fadul, WILPF section Chad. We women from Chad, we are marginalized and oppressed. My country has signed and ratified for CEDAW protocol, but still we suffer from all form of violence. My recommendation here is the UN to evaluate the CEDAW so that it will not be just a symbolic, but it will be implemented, and we can suffer more from the violences that we suffer for many years. Thank you.
My name is Azza Kamil. I am from Egypt. I want the UN to hold the state accountable, and as a woman and as a peacemaker, I think it's very, very important to find a rule and space in the Security Council to reach our voice. Also, it's very important that UN adopt policy and make mechanisms to support women advocates, and also it's very important to stop all weapons and arms, and also to support ISIS. Thank you.
We know. To stop support for ISIS. We get it. We're all clear on that, right? Come on, we're on the same page in this room, right?
So I'd like the United Nations to take the doctrine of responsibility to protect seriously again, to put it on the table, to introduce a feminist perspective into the protection pillar, to emphasize again and bring to the Security Council and to the other member states that sovereignty is a responsibility, not a green light for governments to kill their own people or people of other countries. I'd like it not to be reduced to interventionism and militarization, and I'd like it to be connected to the issue of increased militarization, and that's through putting resources, through putting political pressure, and through using the buy-in of countries who are for the responsibility to protect against those who are not, as we're saying now, a very good technique that seems to be working when we're banning nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. So that's the time we have for this question. I'm going to give it to Madeline to wrap us up.
To wrap you up? God, that was your job. Of course, we started mixing up what we want states to do and the United Nations to do, because that's exactly how it would happen, because member states are going to influence what happens in the UN. I had a recommendation, though, which was, I think, teased from what you have been saying, and that is, we tend to forget that nearly all of our states have ratified, signed up to various international human rights treaties and into certain international legal obligations through the various international law that they have complied with, or say they're going to comply with. Often that is reflected in the various constitutions of those countries. And I'm looking very much at our South African colleagues because you've got the best ever. But so often the representatives do not reflect those obligations when they are negotiating in the Human Rights Council, the CSW. They forget them, they do something, go off on a frolic of their own. What we need to be able to do is to hold that accountability in country, so that when you're sending a delegation, that delegation has to respect its own laws, and it has to respect the international laws that that country has signed up to. If we don't do that, then we're losing a huge advocacy point in terms of the accountability, because I think we've seen this disjunct grow over time as international law has been rejected in favour of realpolitik and economic expansionism. So we need to do that, and then if we are successful in doing that, we should be getting other countries to actually make the same arguments. That essentially, if we have the Swedens of this world saying we've got a feminist foreign policy and we are going to oppose the sale of arms to this country because it's in violation of the Arms Trade Treaty, which you have signed up to, we need that to be supported by other states who again have that same legal obligation. So I think that's hugely important in how we can try to start getting the UN to work within the multilateral system. And that's me mixing up three things now, because that's one thing we can do. So it's from us to the member states, through the international legal framework, to the multilateral system, so that we can see how the checks and balances are supposed to be operating. Right now it's going the other way around. Okay, so now we're going to move into the second part where we want to really look at the UN itself in country. We've had some recommendations already from DRC, what they want to have happen, from Colombia. Totally different. And it's interesting. And I'd like to see, one of the reasons, one thing I would like to see is, why is it so different in Colombia, and why is it they want them to stay when so many other countries are saying, will you go? So obviously, it can be made to work. So we need to find out what makes it work. Barbara.
So Madeline, you basically did the introduction for them as part of the, no, very good. Next part of the session, going deeper into how we want to make the UN work at the national level. I want to throw in another element that was raised by Borna, but that we also discussed yesterday, that we're not only talking about the UN, we're also talking about other institutions that are highly influential in terms of ensuring our economic, political, social rights in country. So if I could throw in the multilateral financial institution, but also other economic actors into this equation, what would that mean in the relationship between how we advocate for a functional and effective UN in country, and how that relates to other key actors that influence our daily life and our daily agenda without
even having the basic mechanisms for inclusion or for consultations with women in civil society. So we actually open the discussion again, go deeper into the conversations and the comments and suggestions that have already been teased out from DRC and from Colombia. And of course, you're invited to continue or comment as well.
Thank you. My name is Olga Krinyuk. I'm from Ukraine and I'm working for WILPF. And I would like to continue your topic of international financial institutions, because WILPF has paid attention to this and has highlighted this issue in the report of CEDAW and UPR. So, for example, IMF conditionalities in Ukraine, they increase indirect discrimination of women, because this is reductions in the public sector, which means reduction in the healthcare and social sector. And also, it not only increases the indirect discrimination, but also increases the overall poverty, because the 3 times increased prices for fuel and heating means that the middle class also was affected. And the IMF in Ukraine is like a very sacred body, which is not criticized. And from the one hand, we see that UN Women in Ukraine really contributed greatly to CEDAW process and to CEDAW reporting, but it means that IMF made increases in direct discrimination, which is there are some contradictions.
Wafa Abdurrahman from Palestine. Actually, to the UN and what has been discussed over the past 2 days, the UN is contributing locally to managing conflicts in order to sustain them. So they're not really working on ending conflicts, and I'll give a very simple example. So instead of calling for lifting the siege on Gaza, you increase the budgets for the humanitarian aid in order for the Gazans not to die in big numbers every day. So this will not end the conflict, it will sustain it. So there is an added value of having a UN agency, and here I'm not referring to UN Women, but other agencies like UNRWA and UNDP and other agencies. On the other hand, the depoliticization of development and aid is problematic, at least in our context. Development is political. As we were saying, feminism is political, and it should be dealt with in such sensitivity. You cannot be naive in the way you do the analysis of the local conflicts and the local structures in order to respond to what is there. So it is political. And the third point has to do with the consultation. We've been talking about the consultation. So consulting, but not really binding to whatever agreement you get with. So now what we're calling for, and this applies to UN and other agencies, not really consultation, but the participation that we were defining for 2 days. The fourth point is the market economy of peace. Today, this is what is offered to us, economic peace. And I think it's offered to so many countries, not only to Palestine. So instead of ending conflicts and reaching a peace resolution, let's, according to Blair, give them something to lose. So this is a strategy that has been imposed in many conflict areas. We believe the UN should actually stand and support us in opposing it. The final point is the question of access. And this takes me to the international NGOs and other international bodies. I work on the ground because I'm closer to my people and their needs. I understand them, I can respond to them. But there is a gap. How can I get access to the different UN agencies, to the states that define and control our future, like the United States and the European Union, etc. I don't feel that I have this easy access. No, the internationals will go and speak on my behalf. I don't feel this is my voice at the table. I want to be there. Maybe they can contribute, helping in refining the messages in a way that the French speakers will understand it and the English speakers will understand it, because my first language is Arabic and I'm translating. I'm not the native. You understand? So it's tuning the messages, etc. Yes, thank you.
And just to say, please feel free to comment upon each other's intervention as well and deepen the analysis in that way. I think you were first, and then in the back, and third, and fourth.
Okay, thank you. Stojan Mishev, Association ESE Macedonia. In relation to the role of the UN organization on national level, I would like to stress one of the problems that we were discussing in the past few days. Actually, it's more out how can we assure that the UN agencies on national level are actually implementing programs which are in line with the national priorities which are already determined. Because what we have heard is that we have identified this negative practice that the UN agencies are imposing their priorities apart from the national priorities which were already determined, and this happened on the field of eliminating domestic violence, especially in Macedonia. I wouldn't get into concrete what was the program about. I would focus more on the concrete recommendation. I would add that the process of our inclusion in civil society sector into the design of their program on national level should be participatory, and we should be part of that process not only on formal level, on declaratory level, but on factual level as well. Because we have faced a situation where, for example, the official opinion of the National Coordinative Body for Implementation of the National Strategy Against Domestic Violence was not taken into consideration by UN agency when they came up with $2 million program to implement in the country. My suggestion will be that maybe we as civil society organization need to document this kind of negative practices, not just talk about it, but to document them with evidences, and in order to discuss them and to come up with mutual solution how to overcome this situation. Because this is implying, this is directly influencing on the sustainability of the civil society sector as such as well. Because apart from their previously primarily role, which was strengthening the capacity of us as a sector, now they are acting as implementing actors in our societies, and that's not a problem. At least let us all work in the same line. But if you're not making any progress, I would say you're making, you can make even more damage in the situation, and that happened in Macedonia. If we make a evaluation now, 10 years after the first national strategy on eliminating domestic violence was adopted, I would say that the situation with domestic violence in the country is worse back than then. And it is really sad, because back in 2008, all the gaps within the system of protection, all the gaps related to the lack of institutional response toward the problems were identified as concrete gaps. As what is the lack of proceeding on the level of police, what's the lack of proceeding on the level of Center for Social Welfare, and all other institutions. The opinion first of the civil society sector, and then again on the National Coordinative Body, which was the official body, was that they should get in line with the national strategy. But when you lack capacities to implement certain initiatives, for you it's much more easier to start from the beginning. And then when you're starting from the beginning, you will make a lot of problems, because you're minimizing and neglecting all the previously achieved results in the country. So my recommendation would be to have a mechanism, maybe from their agencies above, that will assure that the participation on the national level is inclusive and all international priorities are taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Josephine.
Thank you. My name is Josephine Carlson, and I'm from the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation. We support more than 100 women's organizations in conflict-affected countries. I'm here, everyone who's looking for me. I just want to build on previous speakers and perhaps add one more layer to this discussion when we're talking about in many countries now, authoritarian governments are leading the process on actually criminalizing human rights work. Freedom of association and assembly is restricted, and we're talking about state and non-state actors harassing human rights defenders. And we see almost an epidemic of countries copying legislation and practice from each other in doing this effectively. And human rights defenders are forced to use the limited resources and capacity that they have to counter increased bureaucratic obstacles, harassment, and rather to carry on with the important work that we're hearing here. And we've talked to partners and they're facing slander threats, death threats, and on a very high security threat level. And since what we're hearing here, and I want to emphasize earlier speakers, that the formal decision-making bodies are often close to women. So this development affects women human rights defenders especially. And I just want to add that to this discussion. And then what is the UN's role in country, for instance, but also on an international level in recognizing this development and be very aware of their do no harm approach in not contributing to this development, but rather supporting the defenders that are targeted in country. So I just want to add that layer. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to touch on a couple of points. I'm Leslie Ann Foster from Masimanyane Women's Rights International in South Africa. One of the issues that I think is really concerns us is the militarization of societies, our societies, from the local level. And also at the same time, we have an increased muzzling of civil society organizations through legislation at the local level. And I think that there is the whole depoliticizing of the issues that we want to address is of great concern to us. So this muzzling is happening across countries in the African region through legislation now prohibiting funding to come to us and so forth, so that we can't do the political work that is required. And yes, there was a lot of talk yesterday about the fact that, you know, the focus of the work is on service delivery. And I think this is a deliberate strategy to get us not to do the actual work that we should do. I work at the local level, and whenever I come into these conversations, my first concern is how do we build a critical mass of women and men at the local level for the kind of work that is required here? Because we cannot bring about transformative change when it's just those of us who have privilege and opportunity and access. We need to have new ways of thinking of how we bring the voices of others in. We talk about leave no woman behind, but we don't have a strategy for how to actually bring women into these conversations. I loved the term structural exclusion, because all we are talking about now at a national and regional level is looking at and analyzing how does that structural exclusion happen. And one of the ways we are not discussing is the donor community. The donor community is complicit in this exclusion because of the way in which they are structuring their aid programs now, and they deliberately leave out, the the voices, and they become part of the problem in terms of not being able to do the political work, not wanting to support the groups that are actually trying to get together and to do this. So I think that we must look at the structural exclusion in a much wider and deeper context to understand that exclusion in so many different ways. And then, of course, there is also the risk to women's lives. What happens when you engage in these kinds of conversation, how dangerous it becomes, and how much energy it takes, and how the impact of that on women's ability to do the work. And it's costing women lives in ways that we are not counting. We are not counting the ways in which that kind of impact has on them. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Manal Behnam from Iraq. I want to start from the 1990, when the UN had the blockage against the Iraqi people, actually not the government of Iraq. It was a really, really bad blockage against the people. And in 2003, the international community chose to, and the US chose to change a dictator to several dictators on the ground. My interfere here to say that the UN was from 2003 on the ground in Iraq, and they are heading off all the national reconciliation committees, conferences, name it, many activities on everywhere, and even also in Iraq. But the results actually is really very bad. Now we have this very it's a pain with the people that they are suffering right now in Iraq. This is a very important point to highlight, that I'm not talking. I am not very convinced with my government. It's not working very good. But I want from the UN and the international committee to re-evaluate the work in Iraq, to re-evaluate their perspectives. It is the thing. It's not the harm. It's not for the small dictators now. The harm, it's really on the people. The second point I want to highlight is that we have so many strategies, so many protocols, so many things that had been done by the UN and the government and the people, but nothing is working on the ground. One of them, I want to mention a very important thing, that there is a protocol signed by the Iraqi government and the representative of Special Rapporteur of Sexual Violence, Zainab Bangura, and this is a very important protocol, but nothing happened since then. We didn't see anything, and still we have no plan for the victims of sexual violence since 2014, when Daesh had occupied 1/3 of Iraq. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes left of this conversation until we move into what was so elegantly also put up as a question: what is our response, and how do we work together, and how do we ensure that solidarity? But we'll continue for 8 minutes. I have several hands in the back. Randa, Fatima. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Randa Signora from Palestine, from the occupied territory, I would say, because also it's very important to emphasize that we're still under occupation. and remember that there's still, this is the 12th day of the strike of our prisoners in Israeli prisons and detention centers. When we speak about the United Nations in Palestine, it's a very big dilemma, because some of the institutions, we're talking about 22 institutions working in the occupied territory Palestine, Palestine, and many of them are providing humanitarian aid, which we do not undermine, because in that way we need but the dilemma is how much humanitarian aid versus really coming up with resolutions to end this ongoing conflict. That we see that very little is being done. I agree with my colleague Wafa that there is a management of the conflict and the sustainability of the conflict without finding the resolutions. For example, the dilemma is that the office of the OCHA office, which is a humanitarian office directly linked with the Secretary General, they come up with very important reports from the ground because they monitor the situation. And that should be really feed into the United Nations finding solutions to this ongoing conflict and the sufferings of the people under very difficult economic conditions and hardships. Secondly, we find the different UN agencies. The UNRWA is doing the work of a humanitarian organization, also sustaining the situation and the tolerance of the people and their steadfast, resilience to a continued occupation, 50 years of occupation. So that's not resolving much of our problem, except on the practical level, on finding the humanitarian aid under the current situation. But many of the other UN agencies working in Palestine are now coming up with agendas, not necessarily putting forward the priorities that we want. And secondly, competing with them on the same kind of activities. And they have the techniques, they have the expertise to manage the projects much better than we do. So if we start to compete with the United Nations institutions, we are in a very big dilemma. And that also applies to many of the international organizations and the funding organizations who started to post themselves inside the territory and started to take the role of the national or local institution working in the territory. So while we think that the United Nations institutions are very important and we cannot go without them, we think they should be our partners in coming up with initiatives with our collaboration and with our support, and to provide the know-how for the official duty bearers, not only for us, and really to play a role where they can really support our initiatives and not take our initiatives and become theirs, and we are marginalized or taking only part of these initiatives as being our own local and national. And yesterday you drew my attention to a very important issue about the issue of the World Bank. And usually we think, because we speak about the free market and because of the importance that the World Bank gives to development of the economy, and I don't know what, but more to businesses and to free market, we think that the gender feminist approach to addressing issues in the occupied territory is not very well addressed. And drawing my attention to that really means that how we have to look into these issues and come up with our perspective as Palestinian feminists and women activists to see how we can influence all the work that is being done by such a big organization like the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. We have 5 minutes for this part, and you can take your comments and also suggestions into the next session, because we have another 30 minutes. No, or we don't.
Let's go to the next question.
Okay.
We collectively, and then we need to come back.
Well, we have another 5 minutes for this.
Well, we
okay.
Mix it up.
So.
As we are doing anyway.
I'll be quick. Fatima Talib from Morocco. As you know, Morocco is not in conflict, in direct conflict, but Morocco has been and is being affected by all conflicts. And here I want to address the UNHCR and World Organization of Immigration, which are dealing with the refugees who are wandering in Morocco from Syria,
from sub-Saharan countries. Unfortunately, last year we had the figure which was presented officially was 450 Syrian refugees. And I want to launch here a call to UNHCR and the World Organization to open a debate with the civil society, because we do have shelters, we do have our ways to deal with refugees, and we really want them to orient their focus also to us, not just with the government, which is dealing with the issue on its more security side. And this really affects a lot the number of women and children, Syrians and Sub-Saharians in Morocco. The other thing I wanted really to point, it's the implementation of the SDGs and how the Millennium Goals were dealt with in Morocco. It was the Minister of Interior which was in charge of implementing them, and we know the corruption prevailing in Morocco, and we know how things went, deepened poverty, did not stop illiteracy, etc., etc. Now we want UNDP, which is in charge and which is dealing now with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, really to reflect on past errors and try to I don't know, to set accountability measures and avoid what happened with the Millennium Goals, and maybe why not ask civil society to be part of these committees which are going to supervise the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. We're gonna have just a slight shift from the conversation that we're having now into the next panel, and then after the reflections that will be made from the floor, we will move back into our discussion as to how do we collectively move forward as civil society, as human rights activists, as representatives, also from INGOs and local groups. How do we move forward in terms of contributing to the implementation of this agenda that we have put forward? Because I think in terms of the recommendations and practical entry points that you have suggested, they feed back into this complex analysis that we have done collectively in the 8 thematic areas that we did the first day, and we deepened that conversation, as Madeleine said, in the humanitarian and moving into what does sustainable peace mean for us. But how do we collectively, as civil society, as activists, move forward on this agenda and then embed the commitments that are being done by the UN to also ensure that we're moving towards sustainable peace? We are looking for an agenda that is feminist peace. I hear a lot of reference to the notion of what does feminism mean and what does that mean in terms of getting addressed in these institutions. So we very much look forward to the next part of this conversation with you, but I would like to turn to Maria first.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. For setting out the vision and also the how in this session. I think it was encapsulated yesterday in some of the voices that meaningful participation is about being heard and power. And in that regard, I think Fabrizio and Lopa, actually, thank you for being here and listening, but actually also hearing. And they're often different things, as some of us know. In that regard, we'd like to ask Fabrizio to give some remarks and discuss some of the components which you've heard here, the analysis from women's rights defenders, women peace activists, from your position as Assistant Secretary General on Strategic Coordination of the United Nations.
I opened the window, is that okay?
Maybe we could do, if you need a window, I think it's good to open another.
Okay, look, first I'd like to thank you, and in particular Madeleine, for inviting me here. Madeleine is someone who I've long admired and had the privilege of working with in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for some years, some time back, under a truly extraordinary woman who we're very lucky to have back in the United Nations with us, and that's Louise Arbour. Madeleine started by talking about, concluding from the meetings you've had thus far, the disconnect between what is happening out there in the countries you've come from and the reading and subsequent actions of those very same situations, and in those situations. Is this better? Yes. Yeah? Okay. So I was saying Madeleine talked about a disconnect between what is really happening on the ground and how that situation is read and then acted upon by the United Nations and other international organizations. And she made the point that that disconnect happens as a result largely of the UN not listening, and in particular not listening to local organizations, not listening to women's organizations. And then I think in many of the comments that followed, be it with regard to the implementation of the SDGs in Morocco, be it with regard to the actions of the peacekeeping mission in DRC, there were illustrations of what Madeleine said at the outset of a UN that is not well aligned to the needs. And as a result, a UN that it essentially fails in its principal task of preventing a conflict, mitigating conflict. And the point was also made very eloquently by representatives from the occupied territories that what we focus too much anyway on managing conflicts, mitigating the effects of conflicts, as opposed to resolution. I must say, listening to you, if I close my eyes, the tone of voice and the accent is a little bit different, but it sounded very much like the Secretary General. The Secretary General, I mean, he happens to happen the big fault of being a man, but otherwise he is quite gifted. But his whole emphasis is on prevention, and that in recent decades we've both seen an upsurge in new conflicts, and old conflicts are not dying. They're going on, and that there really is a need to focus much more on resolution and much more on prevention of new conflict arising. And prevention is understood, and this was alluded to both by Madeleine at the beginning and many of the comments that were made later. Prevention is understood not just as diplomatic or mediation initiatives, but really tackling the root causes of conflict. And the root cause of conflict, the principal root cause of conflict, and I think there's study after study showing this, and the World Bank, I think, is going to launch or publish a major study on the same theme in September, which will demonstrate this once again. The principal cause of conflict is, of course, exclusion and inequality. And there were many allusions to that. So I do think, in terms of the vision and the understanding of how the UN needs to reposition itself, needs to become a more listening organization, needs to focus more on resolution and less on conflict management, needs to understand better by hearing, not just listening, is very much, the current leadership is very much attuned to the concerns you're expressing. But I don't doubt that that doesn't mean it will be easy to change or fast to change. And I do think your activism through member states, as well as directly with the secretaries, and I hope with colleagues and friends from UN Women, we can open avenues for that. Your continued activism will be critical, and some of the commitments you've made are very important in that regard. One of the points that were made, I think, by the colleague from South Africa was about the inadequacy of women in mediation. And in fact, that one of the commitments of the Secretary General is to improve gender parity in the system. And if we've done a lot of analysis of where we stand now, and if we look where we stand now, the very worst area is in mediators. There's really barely any women in positions as mediators in the United Nations. And that's a problem not just among in the UN itself, it's also among the member states. And I think the call to advocate with your states to improve their representation in the United Nations is very important. I mean, I attended with the Secretary General a meeting of the so-called Friends of Mediation, which brings together some 60 states, and he outlined his vision of having many more women in mediators. And there was applause across the room, but all those applauding were men. And the sort of irony of sort of pushing the UN to show greater equity while taking very little action within the diplomatic representations themselves is a little bit lost, and I think you're reminding them of that is important. I mean, one exception, and I'd like to mention her by name because she is an extraordinary woman, is the representative of Colombia in New York, a woman, Maria Emma Mejia, and we heard from representatives here from Colombia. I had the privilege to serve as resident coordinator 3 years in Colombia, and I think together with some truly extraordinary women's groups and with a very strong UN Women office headed by a very gifted colleague called Belen Sainz, we really managed to promote women's active participation as agents of change in the peace process. And while no doubt it had many areas where it could have been even stronger, I think it remains a best practice and something that many other peace processes can learn from. And then we also had the very active support from the two main countries involved in supporting the peace process, Norway and Cuba, in that regard. There were many references to the elephant in the room, the arms trade, and the need to get that out under control. I'd just like to flag that I think for the first time ever now, the Office for Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations is being headed by a woman, Izumi Nakamitsu, who has a long history in the United Nations, served in Bosnia, among other countries, and is exceptional. So hopefully you'll find in her someone who will advance the concerns you've raised, and I will certainly relay them. Many calls from DRC, Palestine, Morocco, and elsewhere for Macedonia, for the UN to align itself better with national plans. but also, and the friends from Colombia made the same point, that the true challenge is often not just aligning with national plans, but actually making sure that those plans don't just stay on paper, but are turned into reality. In conclusion, I'd just like to say I'm not, I don't want to pretend that I'm touching on all points. I did take detailed notes of all points. I will relay them when I'm back in New York. I have the privilege now of working in the Secretary General's office. I've been in the UN now for almost 30 years. I've worked just about on every continent. I've worked in many of the places that were mentioned. While I believe firmly in the ideals that underpin the UN, in the importance of the norms that it stands for and should stand up for, I also am very aware that it has many, many imperfections. And voices such as yours are absolutely critical to make us better aligned to the challenges. And I also heard what I think is our starting point, and that is that at this time we cannot afford to be complacent. That perhaps more than ever, since the end of the Cold War, the ideals which bind us, which are not just ideals, but as Madeleine pointed out, reflected in the norms that many states have voluntarily signed up for, are now being questioned under the name of security, questioned under the name of economic interest, questioned under the name of a new sort of form of protectionism, and we need to be allies in trying to counter those threats. So I hope working together we can do better, and from where I sit now, and I'm still getting used to that seat, I was literally plucked out of a Bangui in Central Africa, where I was humanitarian coordinator and resident coordinator. That was my last posting, and planted in New York, so I'm still making adjustments, but I hope from where I sit now, I will do my best to open an avenue for your suggestions to be heard and hopefully acted upon in the shared interests of us all, and in particular of humanity. Thank you.
Before Lopa joins us, just stand up and stretch as high as you can. Okay? That includes our UN, stretch as high as you can, as high as you can. Now, that's as high as you can. Stretch higher. Higher. Okay, thank you. So, when we, civil society, I said stretch high as you can, and you didn't. Because when I said higher, you went higher. That's our job vis-a-vis the UN. To keep asking them to stretch higher. So on that note, Lopa, the chief of the civil society section of UN Women. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you, Maria. Thank you to all of you for these last 3 days of inspiration, of ideas, of, as I said earlier, of a reminder of how privileged we are to be here, but most of all, to be working with you and to have, at the end of everything, your faith and trust. Because everything that you have been saying over the last 3 days and now is about us being equal to uphold the faith and trust that you impose in us. Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for being here and for sharing your views. The UN is an organization that was born of a compulsion for peace. And therefore, its task is to promote
protect peace, and to uphold the conditions that are required to prevent war and conflict. The conditions to prevent war and conflict are fundamentally the protection, promotion, and preservation of human rights. Those are it's only the widespread prevalence and enjoyment of human rights by all that will prevent war and conflict. So my question, and I've often asked this, and this is the first time I'm actually verbalizing it in a public space, is if the role of the United Nations is to be a peace organization, which is what it was set up to do, and which is therefore fundamentally to promote and preserve the human rights of all, then why is the United Nations itself not called a human rights defender? Why does not the United Nations look upon itself as a human rights defender? Why are states not human rights defenders? Because that is what they are. States, governments are supposed to uphold their constitutions. They are the defenders of the Constitution. Therefore, they are the defenders of the rights of their peoples. So governments should be human rights defenders. It is not only civil society which is the upholder and the human rights defenders. So I think for us, what we take back is a reconstitution of that notion of who is a human rights defender, and therefore, for us, what is our role? I'm going to talk a little bit about what you said at country and at global level. What is the UN? The UN exists at country level to support member states. That is why it is in countries at the invitation of member states to support member states. But to do what? Not to kill its people, not to promote discrimination, not to sustain violence and conflict in support of political power for a vested group of people. It exists in countries to support and facilitate member states to uphold the human rights of their citizens and their peoples, to live full and equal rights, and to enable member states to uphold the commitments that they have made voluntarily to a global international order of governance that supports all. That's why the UN exists in countries, to enable member states to do this. And therefore, the role of the UN in countries is not to do no harm. It is to protect and promote rights. It's an active role. It's not a passive role. And we need your support to enable us to do that. Because in countries, for the UN to be an activist actor in support of governance and global good. I mean, the idea that everybody, every country works for its citizens and for the good of the world, because we live in a global community. That is the reality of the world today. So how can the UN work in the country to support, to fulfill its role as an intergovernmental organization, but in support and promotion of human rights? It's an activist role. And that means that we need to think about that role differently. Second, I want to talk about, at the global level, the role of the UN is to develop and uphold the standards that are common for a better life for all. And at the global level, therefore, civil society needs to help the UN to be that standard-setting organization, where we have what we have evolved into in the intergovernmental processes is that that role of the UN being a standard-setting organization has been eroded and is being challenged. And therefore, the recognition that these standards are set to improve the lives of all, and therefore those standards need to be set by those people whose lives are being affected and improved, and therefore who should be at the table to set those standards. And that brings us fundamentally to the entire configuration of shrinking democratic space. I want to actually say, when we talked about structural exclusion, that is now what is happening at the UN with the whole situation, not just at the UN, but this is what is happening everywhere in the world. If you look at structural exclusion of who is excluded from the decision-making processes on decisions that are taken about people's lives, who is excluded? If you look at structural exclusion, the other side of that is shrinking democratic space. Because it is actually the same thing. You are excluding people so as to restrict democratic action. And we live in a world defined by inequality and conflict. Women and girls face this in the severest form. They are the most marginalized, they are the poorest, and they face the most violence. Therefore, their rights and their views, as represented by women's rights organizations, are the most salient. Therefore, who should be at the table? Women's rights organizations. For us, for me, what I'm taking back, for us as the UN community that you have invited to be here, when you talk in terms of reclaiming the space at the UN is I want to use ILO's language and the language of sometimes UNAIDS, is a tripartite organization. It is the member states, it is the citizens, the peoples, civil society, and it is the UN agencies and organizations, which is the mechanism, which is the structure, which is the system that the UN agencies and organizations are actually the system that should create that space for conversation and that compact between the member states and civil society. And how can we, as UN agencies and organizations, we are not member states, we are agencies and organizations, fulfill that role? But everything that we have discussed in these last days is about what constrains that and where does the power lie. And the discussion has been that the power structures, when you talked in terms of the power imbalance at the UN, it is about the power being in one part of the UN, which is the member states. The power in the other part of the UN, which is civil society, needs to be not just recognized because it is recognized, but needs to be organized in a manner that it influences the work of the agencies within the global space, but within countries as well. And therefore, the strategies that you are talking in terms of the how, and the strategies to hold the member states accountable and the agencies responsible for, as I said at the beginning, not do no harm, but promote peace. Those are the strategies that we will look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lopa and Fabrizio, for hearing the conversation about resisting. What we've been doing here is reframing, and as it's set out in the title, reclaiming. We're going to end as we started and come back to that last question of collectively. So not thinking about your organization, you as an individual, but collectively, the women's peace movement, the feminist peace movement. How can we, and I'm looking at Lisa again and Barbara, to open the floor for the last 10 minutes, to end on your voices of this session, okay? The last question that we never got to.
So that's how we're going to end. That's our last question. How are we going to make this happen, and how are we going to work together? I hope I see every hand up, but at least I see a few hands up. So we'll start here and we're going to work our way back.
Okay, before we say how, there is an important question. Thanks for all the speakers. It was very deep analysis. I would like to ask, is it possible to do? This is one question.
Yes. Is it?
Yeah. Taking into consideration the full powers, you know, there is a big power can change the world. How can we, in between this, can forward our ideas? And the second question is, for how long? Do we have a plan with the specific times to go ahead with it? I think it's very important to have a time to experience and to examine our efforts. This is one thing. And the second thing is the collective work is very important in this period. Thank you.
Can we do it? That was the question. How long will it take us? How long are we going to do it? Until we get it done, right? As long as it takes. All right, we have a comment right here in the front.
When you're this question, can you stand up and face the room, okay? Because this is about us. So turn around.
Okay. Hi. My name's Brianne. I'm one of the directors for Women's March and the head of Women's March Global. And I think that we saw on January 21st the power of what Women's March was able to do. And that was because we kept it with the grassroots nature. We had over 7 million people march with us around the world. So that being said, obviously, I know we're new on the block, but it's partnering with everybody in this room, existing organizations. What can we do by listening to the everyday woman, the everyday person, right? And the power of this grassroots nature is making sure that we're educating, organizing, mobilizing, right? So when we're able to give the power back to the people and we give them the tools, the education, the resources, they're gonna tell their friends, they're gonna spread the word, and then we're gonna be able to mobilize and bring attention to these issues.
Last year in Afghanistan, I was told by the director of UN Women that I was not to talk about her being a feminist. She said, "I'm the director of UN Women, and I am not a feminist, and I do not align myself with feminism." So the request that I make today, please, is that this appointment that the Secretary General has promised us of larger numbers of women in the United Nations, please do not bring women in who can stand in front of us as directors of UN Women and say, "I am not a feminist." It is quite possible it is quite possible, it is very possible, it is not a difficult thing to scan people's CVs and see what they've been doing in the 20 years before they apply for your P5 and D1 and D2 positions.
More hands?
Hello. Yes. Hi, I'm Karen. I'm from Women for Women International. We're an INGO. I think a lot of us are already part of a lot of women, peace and security networks, and I think there's a big piece that we can do around just joining the dots and joining the national networks that we're part of, the regional networks, and not also just the women, peace and security networks, but also thinking the development networks and the other kind of networks that we're part of, so that we are actually coordinating and organising, and not doing so in a way that networks are then seen as just someone else on an email chain or an email list, but it's actually that we are proactively joining the networks and joining the dots.
So I have three very easy recommendations. I don't know if it's easy, but concrete recommendations. So one, I agree with the mobilizing. I think the Women's March in the US and some other marches in Latin America against violence against women are saying a signal that we need to keep out in the streets. We need to keep saying the things we need to say. So that's one. Two is media campaigns, and I think that also part of the success of the Women's March and is how are we connecting through media and internet and technology. And I think this is something that is still away from women or from many women, especially in developing countries. But we need to continue working on that because it is a very powerful tool. And third is about continuing conversation regarding the F word, as the woman before me said, that the F word, which is prohibited within the UN language, and I keep hearing this more and more and more often from colleagues and friends, feminists working within the UN, saying that we cannot say we are feminists, and if we say things like it looks too much feminist, we've been having these odd looks, and it's just like, how are we, the F word within the UN, how can we continue this conversation with very interesting women and men working inside the UN, but also communicating with women from civil society, from feminists, and also strategize internally, because we need to do both approaches, from within and from outside, because they play an important role, and we cannot let this bureaucracy and this patriarchy continue taking the women's agenda inside the UN.
Good morning, I'm Ayola Male. I agree that we need to mobilize women. We need a global feminist movement that includes men, women, children, the youth rather, because gender equality is everyone's business. And besides, I come from Africa, we have issues relating to laws. Most of our laws are not equal. When you talk about men and women, we need laws that will grant gender parity, especially in Africa. We need to push for that. So mobilizing women is very crucial for this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so I will go to the basics, and I think that to move forward with this, we have to believe that we are really different from each other, and everyone has something to do with the struggle to achieve equality. And it doesn't matter if we are young or old or coming from the MENA or from the West or whatever, but every one of us has something to do and can do something. And once we accept that we are really different from each other, I think this would be a very good step to move forward with this.
Hello. I just have only one message for UN women regarding engaging men in the women movement, or the feminist movement. They need to change their perception of engaging men. I'm talking about the he for she campaign, which I see as an absurd, because We need men to be engaged through all the spaces they dominate, which we are excluded as women from, instead of occupying the very few spaces that we barely have and the very few limited resources we have. Yeah, that's it.
Hello. I just think that we should end on a positive note and say, if we are convinced and have the passion to adhere change, we are capable of doing it. And if we want to do it, we can only do it if women are there to really make the difference, because we have a different perspective. We start from our differences to make us more powerful together, to work together towards the goal that we want. We want to be present, well represented, and we don't accept to be excluded.
Thank you. I'm Zaria Abubakar from Nigeria, representing WILPF Nigeria. I want to talk about the context and content of programs should be local, should have local input, and also should be gender sensitive. There are a lot of UN programs that are not gender sensitive. The interventions they have in, especially in Nigeria, the northeastern Nigeria, there is no consideration for women in their interventions. Basic hygiene of women is not being put in place. It's not part of their interventions. So we'd like to call on that, and also the nutritional part of it, the specific nutritional interventions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Rasha from Yemen. I have a practical recommendation that I wish the UN will take into consideration. As you know, there is the informal expert group for INGOs for the women, peace and security. We want to do a similar one that's focusing on local NGOs and activists coming from civil society at from the national level, from MENA region, or from the countries that are going through conflict, to have some advisory support to the informal working group and to the UN Security Council. Thank you. And I can help in terms of drafting like TOR for this group.
Thank you. My first will be that we should meet more frequently like this. So I would say that we should have this kind of periodical meetings in order to exchange experience, but moreover to come out with common strategies. We also have seen that it's very useful and productive. In this regard, regarding of the representatives who need to be present, national organizations, activists, international organizations, and UN organizations as well. The second one is to maybe collectively to work on concrete thematic initiatives. In this regard, the international organization can play the role and strengthen the cooperation and collaboration between the national organization, international organization, and the UN system, and to be more concrete in relation to implementation of state obligation and application of human rights standards, internationally recognized, to intensify the cooperation with UN treaty bodies as well. In this regard, one of the concrete fields for our future work might be amendment of certain general recommendations in relation to what are the concrete state obligations on the field of protection and promotion of women human rights. A positive example of this was done by Euro Asia Pacific last year when they initiated a process for revision of General Recommendation 19 of CEDAW, which is on violence against women. So, yeah, and it's done. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, from Palestine, I have actually to focus on wealth and the role that I see in the upcoming years. I think if we're talking, and we have been talking about the global feminist movement, I think here I see the role of wealth. meaning having continuous meetings, because one of the outcomes, one of the most benefits that I got from here is the discussion, the analysis. We don't have the luxury back home to have enough time for analysis. We're responding to so many priorities and so many problems, but to sit, think, analyze, and then come up with conclusions, we don't have it. But today and yesterday, the day before, I felt, no, we're thinking collectively, and the analysis was excellent, eyes-opening for all of us to other contexts and to other specific problems in other countries, and this is how we connect with each other. So I would put it in the hands of WILPF. This is one thing. The other thing has to do with the new liberal dominant discourse that is prevailing, not only at the UN, but everywhere. This is why it's very hard to say I'm a feminist, not only at the UN. Try the IMF, World Bank, and other international organizations. To be a feminist, it means it's very hard, if not impossible, to fund by most of the donor countries, by most of the funding agencies. So what we need to do is actually to have our alternative discourse, to strengthen that discourse, in order not to be shy, to stand there and say, yes, I'm a proud feminist. So this is the second job. The third, I'm looking for the criticism that we have been raising towards the UN. And I think what brought us together in the past 3 days is our feeling of urgency, our feeling of the danger. And this is why we got together, and we've been thinking, yes, we love the UN at the end of the day. They're not our enemy, honestly. It's a structure that is there, and we want it to stay, but we're very angry at it. And it's not a contradiction. So my suggestion will be, what about, as I said yesterday, having and trying, and it's not hard to try, a shadow security council that is formed of women, that tries to propose other proposals and show a different procedure and a different way of doing things than what is happening at the Security Council. We can try it as one of the small starting initiatives that we can start with. And as my Yemeni friend Rasha said, I'm willing to draft in terms of reference. Thank you.
I'm Nazizo Madlala Routledge from South Africa. Once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I want to endorse the point that has been made today and has been made 2 days ago every day about the need to build or rebuild the global feminist movement. And endorsing that, I want to suggest that we actually put down an agenda of how we're going to do this. Because, as you know, unity in action is the way to go. And to do that, we need to decide on a minimum agenda. And why I say this is because I know that we are different and coming from different countries, coming from different contexts. We need that one thing or 2 things or 3 things that all of us can agree on, which is going to be our campaign for the next year, for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. Then we can turn our words into action. So I know that we have not yet reached agreement around the table, about a strategy regarding CSW. And I have said this before, but I want to urge us to at least attempt a year-long campaign. I know this year rather, the call to boycott was not really, it happened too quickly before the CSW. So I would like that we use this year leading up to next year's CSW to run a petition online among ourselves, making the call that we have made here, that we would want to see the CSW take more, not just concern, but take action. I would have liked, for example, that this year's CSW should have taken action against the fact that people were excluded from attending CSW. And I know that we fear, and I agree with that fear. We fear that if we are not there, then the others who don't want us there will be very happy to do so. So why not just decide we're going to use this strategy? We're going to use boycott as a strategy, even if we just do it once, just to show that this issue is important to us. I think that would give us a very concrete thing to work on to build a movement.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to say, we heard a lot of great comments in here today. We've heard lofty goals. We have concrete goals. I heard the need to start a global feminist movement to revitalize it, that we have to work together, that we're going to work at it how long? Until we get it done, right? Right? We're going to get it done. And I wanted to make one comment about CSW, which was that if you don't know, there were activists in CSW who were championing the idea that there were people excluded, that there were missing voices. There was an empty chair put in every panelist room to say, that's a chair for someone who should have been here and was excluded. And the Secretary General mentioned the Empty Chairs campaign in his town hall meeting at CSW. And from what I heard was, surprised at the issue of shrinking civil society participation at CSW. So we can make a difference. We can push to have change, but we can only do it together, right? Together we can get it done.
Nina's going to make an announcement first, I think.
Sorry?
Okay, Nina, go ahead.
Okay, everybody, I just want to say, as you all know, then WILPF has been bringing women together for more than 100 years. But another thing we also been doing for more than 100 years is that we've been doing group photos on stairs. So I would like you all to invite you all to have a group photo done after this. It will be another historical photo in the history of WILPF. We will be doing two kind of group photos. Just to give instructions, the one will be where we occupy the entire stairs, facing down on the photographer, and after this we will do on one side of the stairs. So please, when Madeline had the last word, don't stop for the reception, go straight out to the stairs. Thank you.
There you go, I love the idea. Women, WILPF taking photos for 100 years. That's women in action for you. We are a microcosm. I think it's quite incredible in this room. We have a microcosm of different views, different expertise, and we are a movement. And movements don't exist unless we have input energy from everyone participating. And that leads, I just want to thank, first of all, this would not have happened without the movement builders who give their time and energy to organizations like WILPF to make that happen. So I want to name them. I want to name Shilan, Yvette, Lindsay, Catherine, Fatim, Isa, for the incredible work they've put into bringing us here. Real movement builders. And absolutely, we salute you. Thank you. I want to thank Kashi, who for all the help they gave us in getting you rooms where you could actually, spend the night in some level of decency. I want to thank also our live streaming, because that's brought it to a wider audience. And showing just how bad we can look on a big screen. And I also want to thank, because this is so important, and we identified it in our opening, which was, we can't do this unless we have donors who understand what it is to build movements. We couldn't have done this without the Oak Foundation. And I also want to acknowledge NORAD, because they made a substantial financial contribution to bring our MENA colleagues. And UN Women. Because Lopa said to me when we first conceptualized this idea, we need to do this with you. We need to hear what it is that you have to say. And I think there is no question but that UN Women have heard this message. And I know personally that Lopa will take that message back. And I also know that Fabrizio, as a trusted colleague and defender of human rights from way, way back, is going to make absolutely sure that what we've said here will be relayed back to the Secretary General's office. And I should also mention there are many member states who have apologized for not being here present, but who have been tracking what we're doing. And we will undertake, at the invitation of Michael Muller, to then convene a meeting here in Geneva where we will tell member states what we've been saying, where we will tell the representatives of the United Nations at senior levels what it is that we demand that they be doing. And we will continue to demand of ourselves all those efforts that have to be made from local to national to regional to global, inside and outside the United Nations, to make it work in solidarity with each other. Can we do it? Yeah. You've all said yes. Are we in it for the long haul? Yes. Is WILPF going to be part of this? Absolutely. You've challenged us to take on this mantle. And so we've been doing it for 102 years now. Why not do it for a bit longer? It's going to be a while before we can... There's that lovely expression, deeds, not words, and then you get to job done, as Lisa said. Job is not done. Job is a long way from being done, and we are in a particularly dangerous phase, as we all know. Which means we have to regroup, re-strategize. The knowledge that we have would fix everything. There's very little we don't know. I reckon if we sat here for another few days, we could actually have mandates drawn up for DRC, which would actually be fit for purpose. We would have mandates for UN Women in Yemen and Libya, which actually delivered to the peace processes what it is that women are demanding. We would have an entirely new approach to humanitarian assistance and support, creating space for women. There's nothing we don't know. What we haven't been able to do is join those seamlessly together from civil society into the United Nations, through the member states, and deliver it back where it belongs to make a difference on the ground. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Well done. Great job.